John Fogerty and Creedence Clearwater Revival were the very definition of Americana rock. These are the locations essential in defining the rise and fall and rise again of a true music original.
For a lot of people of the 60s era, their first musical influences were Chuck Berry or Elvis. But for John Fogerty, the voice that would set him on his path was Stephen Foster, who was writing songs when Abraham Lincoln was president. And if you're looking for a reason why songs like Proud Mary or Born on the Bayou were invented, look no further. I would imagine on first listen that no one would have believed that this band came from a Northern California suburb. Absolutely no other band sounded more swampy and southern and undeniably original than Creedence Clearwater Revival. So where I'm standing here in El Cerrito, California is about 10 miles from Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco. It's about a mile outside of Berkeley, but it might as well be 1,000 miles from both. John Fogerty and his 4 brothers moved to this house with his parents when he was about 6, and by the time John was 11, his parents were splitting up. And John had a basement room right there, and when it would rain, his room would flood, and he'd have to put 2x4s down to walk from his bed and not get wet. Since he was 8 years old, John had said that he knew he wanted to make rock and roll his life, and his music career first went public at Portola Junior High here in El Cerrito. He was there on a piano playing a couple examples of rock and roll for his 8th grade class when he caught the attention of drummer Doug Clifford and then later Stu Cook. They would form a band and in 1959 do their first official gig as the Blue Velvets. Later they'd start doing shows backing up John's more seasoned brother Tom, who was 4 years older, and it was called Tom Fogerty and the Blue Velvets. But it all started right here. In 1964, John Fogerty had been watching a series on public television called Anatomy of a Hit, and it was about a tiny local record company called Fantasy Records, who, despite having been in business since the 40s, was at last having their first hit with a song called Cast Your Fate into the Wind. So John Fogerty did what any aspiring musician would do. He crossed the bridge here into San Francisco, knocked on their door, and asked if they'd listen to his demo. Long story short, Fantasy Records signed the Blue Velvets featuring Tom Fogerty as lead singer. But Fantasy had zero experience with rock music and was basically run by owners Max Weiss and his brothers. And at the time, Saul Zantz, who you'll hear more about later, was working there as a sales manager. Now we're in San Francisco's Mission District, and this used to be where Fantasy Records was located. It's now the San Francisco Mime Troupe. In November of '64, their first single on Fantasy, Little Girl Does Your Mama Know, was ready, and much like what happened with the Beach Boys a few years earlier, when they opened up the wrapper of their 45, their name had been changed by the Clueless record company to the Gollywogs. This was the first they heard about it, but needless to say, they hated the name, but ended up putting out a half-dozen singles over the next 3 years. And one of the most interesting things that happened here is you can literally hear the band changing from Tom Fogerty singing the more lighthearted numbers to John Fogerty taking over totally on lead vocals. So there was a very rudimentary recording studio in the back, referred to by the band as the Lean-To, and John Fogerty would himself have to work as shipping clerk to physically ship out the band's meager records. But I think the main thing that happened here was that the powers that be in the studio were totally inept at making rock and roll records, and John Fogerty realized it, and he took the bull by the horns and learned how to produce records himself. It was something that would happen again and again in John's career, but it would pave the way for him becoming the arranger, songwriter, and producer. Right here, the former Fantasy Records. So now we're back across the bridge in the East Bay at this former location of the Monkey Inn on Shattuck. It was a notorious UC Berkeley frat bar, and starting in 1964, playing as Blue Velvet and later the Gollywogs, this is where the band first took full shape, with Stu Cook switching from piano to bass, Tom Fogerty playing rhythm guitar, and John taking over as full-time lead vocalist. They played here regularly. It's where they learned how to entertain an audience and figure out how to get them to drink and to dance. I have to say it's ironic, to say the least, that John Fogerty was here playing in Berkeley, the hot spot of the Vietnam protests, when he himself had been drafted and was serving in the U.S. Army Reserves. He had to serve every summer and once a month, and when he wasn't on active duty, he could play with the Gollywogs. But finally, in 1967, he got released from active duty. I think the duality John felt being a soldier and a long-haired musician playing for the Flower Children of San Francisco came out in some of his songs, including what I feel is one of his best anti-war songs ever written, and that would be Fortunate Son. Right here, the former Monkey Inn. In late 1967, Saul Zaentz purchased Fantasy Records and wanted to re-sign the Gollywogs. They said yes under one condition, that they get to change their hated name, and that's how Creedence Clearwater Revival first came about. So Haight-Ashbury here was the center of the scene in those days, and although they were technically a San Francisco band, they were totally at the other end of the spectrum from the jam bands at the time, like, Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead. And I don't know how well received they were by the crowd for that reason. For their first Creedence single, they decided on an old Dale Hawkins song called Susie Q. And I just want to add that Creedence Gut Bucket Swampy Susie Q came out in the same general time frame as the whole Sgt. Pepper psychedelic experimental music era, and it, in its own right, was a pretty courageous choice at the time. Anyways, before its official release, the band got this Susie Q tape to San Francisco radio station KMPX, and they immediately started playing it 4 times a day, and just like that, it took off. Right here, the Haight. After the success of the single on KMPX, they were playing a residency here at what used to be a club called Dino and Carlos, and they often shared a bill with another up-and-coming San Francisco group, Santana. As you can see, it was small, but they were drawing good crowds and putting together the songs that would constitute their very first album, including the single off that, I Put a Spell on You, by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. That first album came out on May 28, 1968, which also happens to be John's 23rd birthday. But although Susie Q reached number 11 on the US charts, there was no inkling about what a force of nature John Fogerty's songwriting would become. We're here in San Francisco's Tenderloin District, and this is Hyde Street Studios. It was formerly known as Wally Hyde or San Francisco, and from Green River on, the majority of the Creedence songs were tracked right here. So the modus operandi was John would write a batch of songs, the band would rehearse them for a couple of weeks, and then come here. They'd lay down basic instrumental tracks, and then John would come in alone to overdub lead guitar, keyboards, and then vocals. John overdubbed all the background vocals himself, and somewhat strangely, he liked to put the background vocals on first and then do his lead vocal. Obviously, there was no automation in those days, so when he was satisfied with the tracks, he would rehearse the fader moves with his engineer and go at a mix. And he had a hard and fast rule about not letting the rest of the band be present at the mix. He felt it was too many opinions diluting the process. So generally speaking, the songs took only a few passes to mix, usually no more than 30 minutes, and from that matter, from soup to nuts, a full CCR album usually took less than 2 weeks and $5,000 to complete. And even by the standards in those days, absolutely incredible. Willie and the Poor Boys was released in 1969, and it had a fantastic album cover that was shot right here on this gritty corner in Oakland, California. Somewhat like the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, John Fogerty wanted this album to have a theme, and he invented an alter ego band called Willie and the Poor Boys. And as you can see, they're playing jug band instruments like washtub bass and harmonica. During the shoot, photographer Basil Perrick reportedly ran out of film and was gone for a while, but the band continued playing the jug band instruments, and it's rumored that they actually came up with Poor Boys Shuffle while they were waiting. Right here, Willie and the Poor Boys. By 1969, Creedence was using this building as their primary rehearsal and office space, and it also became the namesake of their fifth and most successful album, Cosmos Factory. Cosmos because it was drummer Doug Clifford's nickname, and Factory it's because it's where they came to work every day, 5 days a week when they weren't on tour to rehearse. But I think it's worth noting that some of the greatest southern swamp songs ever were written in this Northern California industrial neighborhood. You know, songs like Looking Out My Back Door and Run Through the Jungle were actually written right here. By this time, the cracks in the band were starting to show, and it wouldn't be long before it all fell apart. And that is specifically what John Fogerty was writing about in one of Cosmos Factory's best songs, Have You Ever Seen the Rain? Right here, Cosmos Factory. In early 1971, Tom Fogerty left and Creedence continued as a trio for a time. And ironically, I think their last album, Mardi Gras, is a terrific record. But in 1972, things fell apart for good and the band broke up. This now bucolic children's daycare center is what used to be John's rehearsal and recording studio. It was a house that he had, and it's where he put together the songs for years and years for what would become Center Field. And it's also where he worked on recording the instruments over and over again, painstakingly overdubbed each one of the instruments himself. John remembers this as somewhat of a dark place for him. He was in the midst of multiple lawsuits with, among others, Saul Zaentz and Fantasy Records, and was under a lot of self-pressure here to come up with the goods. And this is where he ended up writing Old Man Down the Road, Rock and Roll Girls, and of course Center Field, right here.
So this is El Cerrito Plaza Shopping Mall, and at times leading up to Center Field, John would come here and park inconspicuously between the other cars and write lyrics. He liked the hustle and bustle and the anonymity that being in his car would provide, and by the way, his perseverance did pay off. In 1985, Center Field went double platinum and ended up at #1 on the album charts. But John's legal problems with his former record company Fantasy were just getting started.
So this here's the former home of Fantasy Records, and after John's stunning success of Center Field, Fantasy decided to sue him for plagiarism on the count that they felt that Old Man Down the Road was a ripoff of Run Through the Jungle, which is absolutely absurd. John, of course, eventually won the case, but he had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to recover his legal fees for the frivolous lawsuit. Anyways, right here, the former Fantasy Records.
I think if nothing else, John Fogerty is an extremely principled man, and the fact that the songs he wrote for Creedence were profiting people he felt had wronged him finally got the best of him. So much so that he took a vow never to play a Creedence song publicly again. And he held on to that vow until February of 1987, when he went to see Taj Mahal and Jessie Ed Davis perform here at what now is a wedding hall and used to be the world-famous Palomino Club in North Hollywood. As he watched the show, he noticed a couple guys sitting in a shadowy corner, and it was none other than Bob Dylan and George Harrison. Eventually, they all got up to sit in with Taj, and when John balked at playing Proud Mary with them, Dylan leaned over on stage and said, "If you don't do Proud Mary, everyone's going to think it's a Tina Turner song." And that was pretty much that. It was the first time he'd played it in years, and I think the moral of this story is never underestimate the power of a poet laureate from Hibbing, Minnesota, not to mention a Beatle.
I think songs like Proud Mary and Born on the Bayou have an enduring Americana quality, much like Stephen Foster, and will be part of our vernacular a century from now. John's brother and former bandmate Tom passed away in 1990, and up until recently, Stu Cook and Doug Clifford were touring as Creedence Clearwater Revisited. Over the past 30 years or so, John has lived down here in Southern California with his wife and family, and he tours with his band that includes his sons Shane and Tyler, and still records new music. And if you like music biographies, John's book, Fortunate Son, is a terrific read. Musically, I think the biggest change for John Fogerty is that after years and years, he was able to finally get back the rights to the publishing on the Creedence catalog. And it was something that he had dedicated much of his life to achieving. And I think it's an understatement to say they're finally back in the right hands. So I'd like to thank all the members of Creedence, and specifically John Fogerty, for the music and your great story. And it's at this point of the show where I would shamelessly request that you like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. And by the way, we've got a pretty cool back library. If you like classic rock, I think you'll enjoy it. Anyways, for Tim, be kind to one another. Peace out. Bye-bye.